Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the smell of old leather and pipe tobacco, the scratch of a quill on parchment listing debts that can never be paid, the hollow sound of dice tumbling across felt, sealing a young woman's fate. Now imagine that everyone in the room knows what's being decided, not a marriage, but a transaction. This is where our story begins tonight on Aristocratic Hearts. Before we step into that smoke-filled room together, tell me where you're joining from. Your city, your time, your current mood, I want to know. We're a global community here, and every comment reminds me that stories connect us across every boundary. Tonight's tale is about a woman sold like chattel to settle her father's gambling debts, and the Duke, whose reputation for ruthlessness was matched only by the fierce devotion he would come to feel for her. It's a story about how the worst beginning can lead to the most extraordinary love, and how sometimes the man society fears the most is the he, one capable of the greatest tenderness. The year was 1851, and Marguerite Bellamy had no idea that the night her father lost his final hand of cards would be the night her real life would begin. The private gaming room at White's was thick with cigar smoke and the particular tension that accompanies men watching another man's ruin. Lord Edmund Bellamy sat at the table with the posture of a man who had already accepted defeat. His once fine evening coat now showing wear at the cuffs, his cravat tied with less precision than fashion demanded. Across from him, Lord Ashford examined his cards with the cold satisfaction of a predator who has finally cornered his prey. "I'm afraid I must call, Bellamy," Ashford said, laying down his hand with theatrical slowness, "unless you have something quite extraordinary hidden up your sleeve." Edmund stared at his own cards, mediocre, as they had been all night, all month, all year. His hands trembled slightly as he set them face down on the table. "I have nothing left to wager, Ashford. You've taken everything." "Not quite everything," Ashford replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. "There remains the matter of your daughter." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, the ripples of shock spreading to every witness. Edmund's face drained of color. "You cannot be serious." "Oh, but I am. 23, is she not? Unmarried, reasonably attractive from what I've observed at various functions. She would make a suitable wife for a man of my years. Consider it a business arrangement. Her hand in marriage, and your debts are cleared. You might even retain your estate." Edmund's throat worked, but no words emerged. Around the table, the other gentlemen shifted uncomfortably. Such arrangements were not unheard of. Daughters had been bartered for financial advantage since time immemorial. But the naked cruelty of the transaction, conducted in full view of society's elite, was unseemly even by the standards of men who trafficked in such matters. From the doorway, a voice cut through the smoke like a blade through silk. "I'll match whatever Ashford has on the table, plus £10,000. Every head turned. Maximilian Ashford, the Duke of Kingsley, stood framed in the entrance, his considerable height and breadth making the doorway seem suddenly inadequate. At 35, he was in the prime of his power, wealthy beyond the comprehension of most men, connected to every significant family in England, and possessed of a reputation that made strong men reconsider their words before speaking in his presence. His dark hair was unfashionably long, brushing his collar, and his eyes, a pale gray that seemed to see through pretense and artifice, were fixed on Lord Ashford with an intensity that made the older man straighten in his chair. "Your Grace," Ashford said carefully, This is a private game. And yet half of London will know of it by morning, Maximilian replied, moving into the room, with the fluid grace of a man supremely confident in his physical capabilities. You're not truly after Bellamy's daughter, Ashford. You're after the humiliation of making him beg. The cruelty is the point, not the girl. So let's dispense with the theater. Name your price for Bellamy's debts. Ashford's face flushed. The matter is not open for negotiation with third parties. Everything is open for negotiation. Maximilian pulled a chair from the wall and sat, uninvited, at the table. I'm offering you more than whatever satisfaction you'd derive from this particular cruelty. £20,000, paid immediately. Bellamy's debts cleared, his estate returned free of encumbrance. You walk away wealthier and without the burden of an unwilling wife young enough to be your granddaughter. And what do you get out of this arrangement, Your Grace? Lord Ashford asked, his tone sharp with suspicion. Maximilian's expression remained impassive. That is my concern, not yours. Do we have an accord? The room held its breath. Edmund Bellamy looked between the two men with the expression of a drowning man watching two ships argue over who would throw him a rope. Finally, Ashford gave a curt nod. Very well. 20,000, paid by week's end. But I want it known that I'm not intimidated by your title, Kingsley. I wouldn't dream of suggesting otherwise, Maximilian replied dryly. He turned to Edmund. Lord Bellamy, you and I should speak privately. Now, it's important to understand what this transaction meant in the context of 1851 England. When we speak of a man's debts being purchased by another party, we're speaking of a legal arrangement that gave the purchaser extraordinary power. The Duke of Kingsley now held not merely the promissory notes Lord Bellamy had signed, but effective control over the Bellamy family's financial future. In an era before bankruptcy laws offered any meaningful protection to debtors, a man in Edmund's position existed entirely at the mercy of his creditors. The Duke could demand immediate payment, which would result in the seizure and sale of the Bellamy estate, leaving the family destitute, or he could demand other forms of compensation. Marriage, in such circumstances, was often seen as the least destructive option. At least the family would retain some connection to their former status, and a daughter married to a powerful man could potentially aid her relations. When Maximilian Ashford told Edmund they needed to speak privately, he was not making a request. He was exercising the absolute authority he now held over the Bellamy family's fate. 20 minutes later, Edmund Bellamy walked out of White's with the expression of a man who had traded one form of damnation for another, potentially worse fate. He climbed into his hired carriage, his own having been sold 3 months prior, and gave the driver his Mayfair address with a voice that shook despite his efforts at control. At the townhouse, Marguerite was in the library attempting to concentrate on a volume of Wordsworth when her father entered. She knew immediately that something had shifted in their circumstances. Her father's face held a peculiar mixture of relief and horror. "Marguerite," he began, then stopped, unable to continue. She set down her book, her heart beginning to race. "What has happened?" "Our debts have been purchased, all of them, by the Duke of Kingsley." For a moment, the name meant nothing to her. Then memory supplied details. She had seen him once, perhaps twice, at large social functions. A tall figure who seemed to occupy more space than his physical form required, drawing eyes not through flamboyance, but through some quality of concentrated presence. A man about whom the other debutantes whispered, though whether in fear or fascination, Marguerite had never been quite certain. "That is good news, is it not?" she asked carefully. "If our debts are cleared—" "They are not cleared," her father interrupted. "They are owed to a different man, and he has made a proposal." Marguerite's hands clenched in her lap. She had not survived 3 London seasons and her family's gradual descent into financial ruin without developing a certain pragmatism about such matters. What manner of proposal? Marriage, to him, in exchange for forgiving the debts and restoring our estate. The words should have carried more weight, should have struck her with greater force. Instead, Marguerite felt a strange sense of inevitability, as though this moment had been waiting for her all along, patient and inexorable. "And if I refuse?" Her father's silence was answer enough. If she refused, they would lose everything. Her mother would be reduced to living on the charity of distant relations. Her younger brother's education at Eton would end immediately. The servants, who had been with their family for generations, would be turned out without references or prospects. Her refusal would not be a personal choice, but a family catastrophe. "When does he expect an answer?" she asked. "He will call tomorrow at 2 o'clock to meet you properly. He asked that I tell you he understands the nature of this arrangement. He does not expect affection or pretense, but he does expect your agreement by week's end." Marguerite nodded slowly, her mind already racing ahead to the practical considerations. A marriage of pure convenience to a man she did not know, had barely seen, whose reputation suggested a capacity for ruthlessness that society both feared and admired. It was not the future she had imagined for herself during those optimistic early seasons when she had still believed love might be possible, but it was at least a future, and it would save her family from complete ruin. "I will meet with him tomorrow," she said quietly, "and unless he proves himself to be a monster beyond all bearing, I will accept his proposal." Her father's relief was palpable, which somehow made the entire situation more grotesque. He thanked her with tears in his eyes, as though she had volunteered for some great sacrifice rather than simply acknowledging the inevitable. After he left, Marguerite remained in the library long into the night, watching the candles burn down while she contemplated the shape of her new life. She did not cry. Tears, she had learned over the past year of her family's decline, were a luxury she could no longer afford. The Duke of Kingsley arrived the following afternoon with the punctuality of a man to whom time was a resource to be managed, not wasted. Marguerite received him in the drawing-room, her mother having arranged herself strategically by the window, where she could pretend to read while maintaining a chaperone's watchful presence. In daylight, without the smoke and shadows of the gaming-room to obscure him, the Duke was even more imposing than memory suggested. He wore his power like a well-tailored coat, perfectly fitted, completely natural, and impossible to ignore. His face was not handsome in any conventional sense. His features were too strong, too angular, too uncompromising for classical beauty. But there was something compelling in the intelligence of his gaze, and the controlled strength evident in his movements. "Miss Bellamy." He greeted her with a bow that was correct but not elaborate. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "Your Grace," she replied, curtsying. "I understand we have a matter of some urgency to discuss." A slight smile touched his mouth, the first genuine expression she had seen from him. "Direct. I appreciate that. Shall we speak plainly, then?" "I would prefer it." He took the chair she indicated, but declined her offer of tea. "Your father will have explained the circumstances. I have purchased his debts. In exchange for your agreement to marry me, those debts will be forgiven, and your family's estate restored free of encumbrance." "A business transaction," Marguerite said. "Precisely. I want to be very clear about what I am offering and what I expect in return. You will be the Duchess of Kingsley, with all the social position and financial security that entails. You will manage my household, accompany me to necessary social functions, and provide the appearance of a conventional marriage. In return, I expect discretion, loyalty, and the fulfillment of your duties as Duchess. I do not expect love, nor will I feign it, but I do promise you respect and fair treatment." "And children?" Marguerite heard herself ask, though the question made her cheeks warm. "Eventually, yes. An heir would be necessary. But there is no immediate urgency in that matter." His matter-of-fact tone about something so intimate was simultaneously reassuring and disturbing. This was indeed to be a purely practical arrangement, then. No romance, no courtship, no pretense that this was anything other than a transaction benefiting both parties. "Why?" Marguerite asked. "Forgive my bluntness, Your Grace, but you could have any woman in England. Why purchase a wife through the mechanism of debt collection?" For the first time, something flickered in his pale gray eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that she would ask such a direct question. "Because any woman in England would want something from me that I am not capable of giving. You, at least, understand the true nature of this arrangement from the beginning. There will be no disappointed expectations, no wounded feelings when I fail to provide declarations of devotion or romantic gestures. We are both entering this with clear eyes. You assume I have no capacity for disappointment," Marguerite observed. "I assume you are a practical woman dealing with difficult circumstances. I watched you just now, Miss Bellamy. You did not weep or wail or attempt to manipulate me with feminine hysterics. You asked reasonable questions and maintained your composure. That, more than anything, convinced me that this arrangement might actually work." Marguerite studied him for a long moment. There was something almost sad in his complete rejection of sentiment, as though he had been wounded in some way that made emotional connection impossible. But that was not her concern. Her concern was her family's survival and her own future security. By those measures, the Duke's proposal was more than adequate. "I accept," she said simply, "with one condition." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Which is?" "My younger brother is currently at Eton. I want your assurance that his education will continue uninterrupted, and that provision will be made for his eventual establishment in an appropriate career or position." "Done," the Duke replied without hesitation. "I will also settle an annual income on your parents, sufficient to maintain their current household and staff. Is there anything else?" "No, Your Grace." "Then we have an agreement." He stood, and Marguerite rose as well. "I will obtain a special license. We can be married by the end of the week. My solicitors will have the relevant documents prepared for your father's signature." "So quickly?" Marguerite's mother spoke for the first time, her voice thin with shock. "The matter is settled," the Duke replied. "There is no benefit to delay." He turned back to Marguerite. "If you wish, I can arrange for a modest trousseau to be provided. My man of business will contact you regarding necessary preparations." "That is very thoughtful, Your Grace," Marguerite said, though the idea of a trousseau seemed absurd under the circumstances. This was not a real wedding requiring bridal finery. This was a contract being executed. After he left, Marguerite's mother collapsed into her chair with a fluttering handkerchief. "Oh, my dear," What have we done? The Duke of Kingsley. They say he is so cold, so frightening. They say many things about many people. Marguerite replied calmly. He has offered fair terms. Our family will be secure. That is what matters. But later, alone in her chamber, Marguerite allowed herself a moment of pure, crystalline terror. In 4 days, she would marry a man she did not know. She would leave her family home and enter his world as his Duchess, his property, his responsibility. The life she had imagined for herself, however modest those imaginings had become, was ending. Whatever came next existed beyond her ability to envision. She pressed her palm against the cool glass of her window and looked out at the London street below, watching carriages pass and people hurry about their evening business. Somewhere in this vast city, the Duke of Kingsley was also looking out a window, perhaps thinking similar thoughts. Or perhaps not thinking of her at all, having completed the day's business transaction and moved on to the next item requiring his attention. "Not a debt," she whispered to the glass, remembering her father's words about the Duke's proposal. A wife, but in her heart, she wondered if there was really any difference. Continuing story, Part 2 of 8. The wedding took place 4 days later at St. George's Church in Hanover Square, with only immediate family and necessary witnesses in attendance. Marguerite wore a dress of pale blue silk, practical enough to be worn again, beautiful enough to be appropriate for a duchess, and carried a small bouquet of white roses. The Duke wore formal morning dress, his cravat tied with military precision, his expression unreadable as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm. The ceremony was brief. Marguerite spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, committing herself to a man whose Christian name she had only learned the day before, Maximilian. It suited him somehow, grand, imposing, vaguely martial. When he slipped the wedding band onto her finger, his hands were steady and warm, the touch impersonal, yet not unkind. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the vicar intoned. "You may kiss the bride." The Duke, her husband now, she corrected, herself, leaned down and pressed a brief, chaste kiss to her lips. It was over almost before it began, but Marguerite felt the warmth of it nonetheless. Her first kiss from the man to whom she now belonged in every legal and social sense. The wedding breakfast was held at the Duke's London residence, a massive Georgian townhouse in Grosvenor Square that made the Bellamy home look like a cottage by comparison. Marguerite moved through the reception in a daze, accepting congratulations from people she barely knew, watching her mother weep tears that seemed equal parts relief and sorrow, observing her father's careful avoidance of the Duke's gaze, shame, perhaps, at how this marriage had come to pass. "Are you well?" The Duke materialized at her elbow, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Quite well, thank you." "You needn't lie for my benefit. This must be overwhelming." Marguerite looked up at him. She had to tilt her head back considerably given their difference in height. "I am managing, Your Grace." "Maximilian," he corrected quietly. "We are married now. In private, at least, we need not stand on such ceremony." "Maximilian, then." The name felt strange in her mouth, too intimate for the formal distance between them. "And you must call me Marguerite. Marguerite." The way he said it, with careful pronunciation of each syllable, made it sound like something precious being examined and catalogued. "It suits you." Before she could respond, they were interrupted by well-wishers demanding the Duke's attention. Marguerite used the opportunity to slip away to a quiet corner, needing a moment to breathe, to process the reality that she was now the Duchess of Kingsley, that the ring on her finger represented not love or romance, but a transaction completed, a debt settled. "You look like you could use this," a voice said beside her. She turned to find a footman offering a glass of champagne. She accepted it gratefully and took a long sip, letting the bubbles and alcohol steady her nerves. The reception concluded by late afternoon. The Duke informed her that they would depart for his country seat, Kingsley Park in Derbyshire, the following morning. "I thought you might appreciate one night in familiar surroundings before the journey," he said. "You're welcome to stay at your family home tonight if you wish." "That's very considerate," Marguerite replied, surprised by his thoughtfulness. "I will collect you at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Bring whatever you cannot part with immediately. The rest can be sent on later." That evening, back in her childhood bedroom, Marguerite packed her most precious belongings with her mother's tearful assistance. Books, letters from her brother at school, a few pieces of her grandmother's jewelry, her father's gift of a watercolor set from happier times, tangible pieces of the life she was leaving behind. "You're doing a brave thing," her mother said, folding one of Marguerite's chemises. "Saving us all." "I'm doing the only thing," Marguerite replied. "Brave would imply I had a choice." "He might not be as terrible as his reputation suggests," her mother offered hopefully. "He was very correct throughout all of this. Almost kind in his way." Marguerite thought about the Duke, about Maximilian, and his careful promises, his clear delineation of expectations. Kind was not the word she would use. Honest, perhaps. Fair-minded, but not kind. Kindness implied warmth, and the Duke was as cold and distant as the winter moon. That night, she barely slept. Tomorrow she would leave London, leave her family, and begin her life as the Duchess of Kingsley. The magnitude of the change was almost incomprehensible. At dawn, she rose and dressed in her traveling clothes, a practical ensemble of dark green wool that her mother had purchased with funds the Duke had advanced. Her family gathered in the entrance hall to say their farewells. Her father embraced her stiffly, his eyes red. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair. "I know what you've sacrificed." "Take care of Mother and George," she replied. "That's all I ask." Her mother's tears were predictable, but still difficult to witness. "Write to us often. Tell us you're well." "I will," Marguerite promised, though she had no idea if she would be well or not, if her new life would allow space for such things as letter-writing and family connection. The Duke's carriage arrived precisely at 9. It was an elegant vehicle, well-sprung and comfortable, with the Kingsley coat of arms emblazoned on the door. The Duke himself handed her inside, his grip on her gloved hand firm and steady. "Ready?" he asked. No, she thought, but she nodded anyway. The journey to Derbyshire would take 2 days with stops at coaching inns. The Duke had arranged private rooms at each location, separate chambers for both nights. "I thought you might appreciate time to adjust before the full reality of our arrangement," he said as they left London behind. Marguerite appreciated his delicacy, even as she recognized it for what it was. More evidence that this was a business arrangement, not a marriage of passion that required immediate consummation. They traveled mostly in silence, the Duke occupied with correspondence and papers, Marguerite watching the countryside roll past. Green fields gave way to rolling hills, small villages clustered around ancient churches. England in springtime was beautiful, and she tried to focus on that beauty rather than the anxiety churning in her stomach. At the first coaching inn, they dined together in a private parlor. The Duke was polite but distant, inquiring after her comfort, ensuring she had everything she needed, but offering little in the way of personal conversation. It was like dining with a very solicitous stranger, pleasant enough, but utterly impersonal. The second day passed much like the first. Late in the afternoon, the carriage turned down a long, tree-lined drive. "We're here," the Duke said simply. Kingsley Park revealed itself gradually, first the ornamental lake, then the formal gardens, and finally the house itself, a magnificent Palladian mansion of honey-colored stone that seemed to glow in the late afternoon light. It was vast, imposing, and utterly intimidating. "Your new home," the Duke said, watching her face. "What do you think?" "It's beautiful," Marguerite said honestly, "and terrifying." For the first time, she saw something like real amusement in his expression, an honest reaction. Most people would offer only compliments. "You said you valued directness." "I do." He stepped down from the carriage and offered his hand to help her descend. "Come. Let me introduce you to the household." Continuing story. Part 3 of 8. The staff of Kingsley Park lined up in the entrance hall with military precision. Butler, housekeeper, footman, maids, all arranged by rank and standing at attention. Marguerite had grown up in a household with servants, but this was something else entirely. There must have been 30 people present, all watching her with varying degrees of curiosity and assessment. Mrs. Thornton, the Duke addressed the housekeeper, a formidable woman of perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair and a posture that suggested she tolerated no nonsense. "This is Her Grace, the Duchess of Kingsley. Please ensure she has everything she requires." "Of course, Your Grace." Mrs. Thornton's curtsy was precise, her expression professionally neutral. "Welcome to Kingsley Park, Your Grace. I've had the Duchess's chambers prepared." Marguerite was shown to her rooms, a suite of chambers that included a sitting room, bedroom, and dressing room, all decorated in shades of cream and gold, with windows overlooking the gardens. It was more luxurious than anywhere she had ever lived, and yet it felt utterly impersonal, like a very elegant hotel room rather than someone's actual home. "The Duke's chambers are connected through that door." Mrs. Thornton indicated a door in the far wall, currently closed. "But His Grace rarely disturbs the Duchess's privacy. Your maid will be up shortly to help you unpack and dress for dinner. Dinner is served at 8 in the small dining room, when you and His Grace are dining alone." After Mrs. Thornton departed, Marguerite sank onto the edge of the bed and looked around her gilded cage. For that's what it was, she realized. Beautiful, comfortable, but a cage nonetheless. She was the Duke's property now, his wife, his Duchess. The door connecting their chambers might be closed now, but it could open at any time at his discretion. A knock announced the arrival of her maid, a young woman named Lucy, who helped her unpack and change for dinner. Lucy was pleasant and efficient, answering Marguerite's questions about the household with careful deference. Yes, His Grace was an exacting master, but fair. No, he did not entertain often. Yes, the staff was curious about their new Duchess. There had been speculation for years about when and whom the Duke might marry. Dinner was a strangely formal affair for just the two of them. The small dining room could have comfortably seated 12, and they sat at opposite ends of a long mahogany table, served by silent footmen who appeared and disappeared with each course. The distance made conversation difficult, which perhaps was the point. "Are your rooms satisfactory?" the Duke asked between courses. "Very much so, thank you." "Tomorrow, Mrs. Thornton will show you the rest of the house and explain your duties as Duchess. If you have questions or concerns, please bring them to me directly. I will." Another stretch of silence, broken only by the clink of silver on porcelain. "Maximilian," Marguerite ventured, "may I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you really intervene at White's? It cannot simply have been about preventing Lord Ashford's cruelty. You could have done that without marrying me." The Duke set down his fork and studied her for a long moment. "You're right. It wasn't only about Ashford's cruelty, though that was certainly part of it. The truth is, I am 35 years old, and society has certain expectations about dukes and heirs. I needed a wife, and I wanted one who would not expect things I cannot provide. You, facing your family's ruin, were in a position to appreciate a practical arrangement. It was efficient." "Efficient," Marguerite repeated. "What a romantic way to describe a marriage." "I never promised you romance," he replied, "but without heat. I promised you honesty. Would you prefer I lied and pretended this was some grand passion?" "No," she admitted. "I suppose I wouldn't." After dinner, the Duke excused himself to his study, leaving Marguerite to her own devices. She returned to her chambers, where Lucy had turned down the bed and left a nightgown laid out. Marguerite changed and climbed into the enormous bed, feeling very small and very alone in the vast room. This was her wedding night, she realized. Not the passionate encounter young girls dreamed of, but a solitary vigil in a strange bed in a strange house, married to a stranger who had purchased her to settle debts. She waited, tense and uncertain, for the door between their chambers to open, for her husband to claim his marital rights. But the door remained closed, and eventually, exhausted by emotion and travel, Marguerite fell into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, Mrs. Thornton conducted a thorough tour of Kingsley Park. The house was even larger than Marguerite had initially realized. 48 rooms spread across 3 floors, with servants' quarters in the attic and extensive cellars below. There was a library that rivaled some university collections, a music room with a magnificent pianoforte, a portrait gallery featuring generations of stern-faced Ashfords, and a long gallery where the current Duke apparently rode his horse on rainy days when he couldn't exercise outdoors. "Rode his horse," Marguerite repeated, certain she had misheard. "Yes, Your Grace. His Grace is particular about maintaining his physical condition. The long gallery is a quarter-mile from end to end. Quite suitable for riding, His Grace says." Marguerite filed this information away as another piece of the puzzle that was her husband, a man who rode his horse indoors. It was simultaneously ridiculous and oddly endearing. Her duties, Mrs. Thornton explained, would include overseeing the household staff, planning menus, managing the household accounts, receiving visitors, and hosting whatever entertainments the Duke required. "His Grace is not one for large parties," Mrs. Thornton said, "but there are certain obligations that come with his position. You will be expected to fulfill those obligations with appropriate grace and dignity." "I understand," Marguerite said, though the weight of responsibility was already settling on her shoulders like a lead cloak. Over the following weeks, Marguerite began to establish her routine at Kingsley Park. She met with Mrs. Thornton each morning to review household matters, spent afternoons reading in the library or walking the gardens, and dined with the Duke each evening before he retreated to his study or his private chambers. It was a lonely existence, but not an unpleasant one. She had access to everything she could possibly need materially, and the Duke, while distant, was never unkind. But the nights remained solitary. The door between their chambers stayed firmly closed. and Marguerite found herself in the peculiar position of being a married woman who had never truly been with her husband in any meaningful sense. "Your Grace seems troubled," Lucy observed one morning while helping Marguerite dress. "Do I?" Marguerite replied absently. "If I may say so, Your Grace, the staff has noticed that His Grace has not. That is, they wonder if perhaps you and he—" Marguerite understood what the maid was delicately trying not to say. The servants had noticed that the marriage remained unconsummated. It was the sort of thing servants always knew, no matter how private the parties tried to be. "His Grace is very occupied with business matters," Marguerite said coolly. "Our arrangements are not the concern of the household staff." "Of course, Your Grace. I apologize." But later, alone in the library, Marguerite found herself deeply unsettled. Was this to be the pattern of her entire life? Married, but not truly a wife. Living in the same house as a man who treated her with scrupulous courtesy, but no warmth, no intimacy, no real connection. She was so lost in these thoughts that she didn't hear the Duke enter the library until he spoke. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Marguerite looked up, startled. The Duke, Maximilian, stood just inside the door, still dressed in his riding clothes, his dark hair windswept. It was the most disheveled she had ever seen him, and somehow it made him seem more human, less like the marble statue he often resembled. "Not at all," she replied. "Did you have a pleasant ride?" "I did." He moved further into the room, examining the book she held, Wordsworth. "Do you enjoy poetry?" "Very much." "As do I." He selected a volume from a nearby shelf. Byron, naturally. "Though I confess my tastes run to the more dramatic." They stood there in companionable silence for a moment, and Marguerite felt something shift slightly in the atmosphere. This was the most relaxed she had ever seen him. The most their interaction had resembled an actual conversation between two people, rather than a stilted exchange between business partners. "Marguerite," he said suddenly, "are you content here?" The question surprised her. "I have everything I could possibly need materially. That is not what I asked." She considered how to answer. "I am adjusting. The house is beautiful. The staff is excellent, and you have been very correct in all your dealings with me." "Correct," he repeated, his mouth quirking slightly. "That is a very diplomatic word. What would you prefer I say?" "The truth, perhaps. That you are lonely. That this arrangement is not what you would have chosen for yourself. That I am failing as a husband in every way that matters." The raw honesty of his words left her momentarily speechless. "You have not failed," she said carefully. "You have provided everything you promised. Except companionship, except warmth, except any of the things that make a marriage more than a legal contract." He set his book down with more force than necessary. "I thought I could do this. Maintain the distance. Treat you as I would any business arrangement. But I find I cannot." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I want to try. To be more than just your husband in name. To actually know you, Marguerite. To have you know me, if you're willing." Marguerite's heart was racing. This was not part of their agreement. They were supposed to be business partners, nothing more. And yet something in his eyes, a vulnerability she had never seen before, called to something in her own heart. "I'm willing," she heard herself say. "But I don't know how to begin." "Neither do I," he admitted. "But perhaps we could start with something simple. Would you ride with me tomorrow morning? I could show you the estate." "I would like that very much." He smiled, a real smile the first she had seen from him, and Marguerite felt something warm unfurl in her chest. Perhaps this marriage of convenience might become something more after all. Perhaps the man who had purchased her to settle debts might become something other than a stranger with whom she shared a house. It was at least a beginning. Continuing Story, Part 4 of 8. The morning ride became a daily ritual. Maximilian was an excellent horseman. She might have guessed this from his habit of riding indoors, and he selected a gentle mare for Marguerite, matching his pace to hers as they explored the extensive Kingsley lands. He showed her the tenant farms, the village of Kingsley Abbas with its medieval church, the folly on the hill that offered views clear to the Peak District on fine days. And as they rode, they talked. Real conversations, not the stilted formalities of their dining-room exchanges. She learned that he had inherited the dukedom at 21 when his father died in a hunting accident, that he had a younger sister married to a Scottish earl, that he preferred the country to London, that he had fought briefly in the Crimea before his title brought him home. "I saw things there that changed me," he said one morning as they paused by a stream to let the horses drink. War has a way of stripping away pretense. Life and death become very simple, very immediate. When I returned to England, all the social niceties, the games people play, it all seemed unbearably false. I couldn't engage with it any more. I think that's why. People find me cold. "You're not cold," Marguerite said. "You're careful. There's a difference." He looked at her with surprise. "You think so? I think you've been hurt, and you protect yourself by maintaining distance. But I also think you're capable of more than you allow yourself." "And what about you?" he asked. "What has life taught you?" Marguerite considered that the world is not kind to women without fortune or power, that we are commodities to be traded, our value determined by factors beyond our control, but also that we are stronger than anyone gives us credit for. I may have been sold to settle debts, but I am still here, still myself. Your wife, yes, but also still Marguerite. I never wanted you to feel like property," Maximilian said quietly. "I know, and I'm beginning to understand that you saved me as much as you purchased me. Lord Ashford would have been cruel. You at least have been kind." "Kind," he repeated. "That's the second time you've used that word. About me. I'm not accustomed to it. Then perhaps people don't know you very well." Something in his expression shifted, softened. Perhaps they don't. Or perhaps only one person is beginning to. The weeks passed, and the distance between them continued to shrink. They began taking meals together in a smaller, more intimate dining room. He showed her his study, explaining the complex management of his estates and investments. She played the pianoforte for him in the music room, revealing the one artistic accomplishment her mother had insisted she cultivate. "You're very talented," Maximilian said after she finished a particularly complex Beethoven sonata. "I'm adequately trained," Marguerite corrected. "There's a difference." "Must you always be so modest about your accomplishments? Must you always be so skeptical of compliments?" They stared at each other for a moment, then both laughed, a shared moment of genuine amusement that felt like a small miracle. But the door between their chambers remained closed, and Marguerite found herself increasingly confused about what she wanted. The Duke, Maximilian, was becoming less of a stranger, and more of a friend, a companion, something more. One evening, 6 weeks after their wedding, they were in the library together, a habit they had fallen into, each reading in companionable silence while a fire crackled in the hearth. Maximilian set down his book suddenly. Marguerite, I must confess something to you." She looked up from her own reading. "What is it?" "I find myself in a peculiar situation. When I proposed this arrangement, I believed myself incapable of romantic feeling. I had convinced myself that the best I could manage was a marriage of practical convenience. But I was wrong." Marguerite's heart began to race. "Wrong how?" "I care for you more than I intended, more than I thought myself capable of. I think about you constantly, whether you're happy, what you might be doing, what might make you smile. I wait for our morning rides like a schoolboy, anticipating a treat. I have dreams where—" He stopped abruptly, color rising in his cheeks. "Forgive me. I'm speaking inappropriately." "You're speaking honestly," Marguerite said quietly, "which is what we agreed upon from the beginning. Are you, that is, do you—" He seemed utterly, uncharacteristically flustered. "Do you feel anything similar? Or am I alone in this?" Marguerite set her book aside and moved to sit beside him on the sofa, a breach of their usual careful physical distance. "You are not alone. I have come to care for you as well, Maximilian. You are not at all the man I thought you were when we married. You are better, kinder, more vulnerable and more strong at the same time. I find myself wanting to know everything about you, and I find myself wishing—" She trailed off, uncertain how to articulate the longing that had been building within her. Wishing what? His voice was rough, his pale gray eyes intense upon her face. That our marriage might be real, in every sense. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hands. His palms were warm, slightly calloused from riding. "Marguerite, I want nothing more than to make this marriage real. But I will not rush you. You were given no choice in becoming my wife. I want you to choose this next step willingly." "I choose you," she whispered. "I choose us." He kissed her then, and it was nothing like their brief, impersonal wedding kiss. This was heat and longing and tenderness all at once, his mouth moving against hers with a hunger that matched her own. Marguerite responded instinctively, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Maximilian rested his forehead against hers. "Your chambers or mine?" he asked with a hint of humor. "Does it matter?" "Not in the slightest." He stood, drawing her up with him, and led her to the door that had remained closed since their wedding night. Her chambers were closest. He opened the door, and for the first time they crossed that threshold together. What passed between them that night was not the cold transaction Marguerite had once feared. It was passionate and tender by turns, clumsy in some moments and perfect in others. And when it was done, Maximilian held her close, his face buried in her hair. "I never knew," he whispered. "I never understood what I was missing." "Neither did I," Marguerite replied, tracing patterns on his bare chest. "Neither did I." The transformation in their relationship after that night was remarkable. The separate chambers remained, both valued their private space. But the connecting door stood open now, an invitation rather than a barrier. They spent their nights together more often than not, learning the geography of each other's bodies, discovering what brought pleasure, building the physical intimacy that had been missing from their marriage. But it was more than just the physical. Maximilian began to share more of himself, his fears, his dreams, the loneliness that had haunted him for years. He told her about his father, a harsh man who had seen emotion as weakness. He told her about the first woman he had loved, who had married his best friend for a larger fortune. He told her about the wall he had built around his heart, and how Marguerite had somehow found a way through it. In turn, Marguerite shared her own vulnerabilities, the helplessness she had felt watching her family's decline, unable to prevent it, the shame of being sold like property, even as she understood the necessity, the fear that she would never be more than a transaction, that she was unworthy of genuine affection. "You are worthy of everything," Maximilian told her fiercely. "You are brilliant and brave and beautiful, and I am in awe that you are mine." "I am yours," she agreed, "but you are also mine. We belong to each other now." Summer arrived, and with it, the necessity of returning to London for the remainder of the season. Marguerite had been dreading this, the return to the society that knew how their marriage had come about, the whispers and speculation and barely concealed pity. "We don't have to go if you don't wish it," Maximilian said when she voiced these concerns. "My obligations can be managed from here." "No," Marguerite said firmly, "we cannot hide forever, and I will not give anyone the satisfaction of thinking I am ashamed." "Ashamed of what? Being my wife?" "Ashamed of how I became your wife. But I am not. You saved my family from ruin. You have given me a life of comfort and security, and more importantly, you have given me yourself. That is nothing to be ashamed of." He pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "You are magnificent. Do you know that? I am the luckiest man in England." "Then let us go to London and show them all just how lucky you are." Continuing story, Part 5 of 8. Their return to London was marked by intense scrutiny. The Ton had not forgotten the circumstances of their hasty marriage, and speculation ran rampant about the state of affairs between the cold, fearsome Duke of Kingsley and the young woman he had purchased to settle her father's debts. The first major social event they attended was a ball hosted by the Duchess of Devonshire. Marguerite dressed with particular care, choosing a gown of deep sapphire silk that brought out the blue in her eyes. Her maid arranged her hair in an elegant updo, and she wore the Kingsley sapphires, a magnificent parure that had belonged to Maximilian's grandmother. "You look breathtaking," Maximilian said when he came to collect her. He was resplendent in black evening dress, his cravat tied simply but perfectly, his presence commanding as always. "And you look like you're preparing for battle," Marguerite observed, noting the tension in his shoulders. "Aren't we?" He offered his arm. "Let us show them what we are, together." The moment they entered the ballroom, conversation quieted noticeably. Eyes turned toward them, fans fluttered with whispered commentary, and Marguerite felt the weight of judgment settling on her shoulders like a physical thing. Then Maximilian did something unexpected. Instead of leading her towards the edge of the room, where they might fade into relative obscurity, he led her directly to the center of the ballroom floor, just as the orchestra was striking up a waltz. "May I have this dance, Your Grace?" he asked formally, but his eyes held warmth and a hint of challenge. "You may, Your Grace," she replied, matching his tone. He swept her into the waltz, and Marguerite was reminded that he was an excellent dancer. Surprising in a man of his size, but he moved with natural grace and strength. As they turned and spun across the floor, he kept his eyes locked on hers, shutting out the watching crowd. "Let them look," he murmured. "Let them see that you are mine, and I am yours. Let them see that we are not ashamed." "I'm not ashamed," Marguerite whispered back. "But I won't pretend their judgment doesn't sting." "Then lean into me," he said, pulling her closer than strict propriety allowed, and let me bear the weight of their judgment for both of us. By the end of the waltz, the quality of the watching gazes had shifted slightly. There was still curiosity, still speculation, but also something else. Interest, perhaps, or the recognition that whatever this marriage was, it was not the cold transaction they had assumed. Lady Ashford approached them as they left the dance floor. "Your Graces," she said with a curtsy that was just this side of mocking. "How lovely to see you both. Married life seems to agree with you." "It does," Maximilian replied coolly. "Thank you for your observation." "And you, Duchess," Lady Ashford continued, turning to Marguerite with false sweetness. "You must be so grateful for His Grace's generosity in rescuing your family from such unfortunate circumstances." Before Marguerite could formulate a response that was both dignified and cutting, Maximilian stepped forward. His voice, when he spoke, was low and dangerous, the voice of the man who had built an empire and crushed his business rivals without mercy. "You will address my wife with respect, Lady Ashford, or you will not address her at all. Her family's circumstances are not a subject for public entertainment, and any suggestion that she should be grateful to me rather than I to her reveals a profound ignorance of her worth and my extraordinary fortune in securing her as my Duchess. Do I make myself clear?" Lady Ashford paled. "Of course, Your Grace. I meant no offense. Then I suggest you choose your words more carefully in the future." He turned to Marguerite, his expression softening immediately. "Shall we take some air in the garden?" As they walked away, leaving Lady Ashford standing in stunned silence, Marguerite felt a fierce surge of affection for this man who would so fiercely defend her honor. "That was very well done," she murmured. "I will not tolerate anyone treating you as less than you are," Maximilian replied. "You are the Duchess of Kingsley. More importantly, you are my wife, and I will not allow anyone to forget that those titles carry weight and demand respect." In the garden, away from the crowd, he pulled her into a shadowed alcove and kissed her thoroughly. "I love you," he said when they finally broke apart. "I should have said it before now. I love you, Marguerite. Not as a convenient wife or a business arrangement. As the woman who changed my life, who taught me how to feel again, who makes every day better simply by existing." Tears sprang to Marguerite's eyes. "I love you too. So much that sometimes it frightens me. I never imagined feeling this way about anyone, least of all the man who married me to settle debts." "I never imagined feeling this way about anyone either," he admitted. "But here we are. Improbably, impossibly in love. A marriage of convenience that became something far more precious." They stayed in the garden for some time, reluctant to return to the scrutiny of the ballroom. When they finally did rejoin the company, something had shifted. Perhaps it was the glow that surrounded them, the obvious devotion evident in every glance and touch. Perhaps it was Maximilian's fierce defense of Marguerite's honor. Whatever the cause, the quality of the attention they received was different, less mocking, more curious in a genuine rather than malicious way. Over the following weeks, they attended numerous social functions, and with each one, Marguerite grew more confident in her role as Duchess. She handled the subtle slights and occasional outright rudeness with grace, secure in the knowledge that Maximilian stood firmly at her side. But the greatest test came when they encountered Lord Ashford at a dinner party. He approached them with his wife in tow, his expression carefully neutral. "Your Graces," he said with a bow, "I wanted to offer my congratulations on your marriage, belatedly perhaps, but sincerely." Maximilian's expression was unreadable. Thank you, Lord Ashford. I also wanted to apologize, Ashford continued, and now there was genuine discomfort in his face, for my behavior at White's. It was cruel and beneath me. I was attempting to humiliate Lord Bellamy, but in doing so, I placed Miss Bellamy, that is, Her Grace, in an unconscionable position. I am sorry. Marguerite studied him, trying to determine if the apology was genuine or merely expedient. She decided it didn't matter. Your apology is accepted, Lord Ashford. What's past is past. You are gracious, Ashford said with evident relief, more gracious than I deserve. After he departed, Maximilian took Marguerite's hand. You didn't have to forgive him. I know, but holding on to anger serves no purpose. He did a terrible thing, but from it came something good. I don't condone his actions, but I can acknowledge that they led me to you, and I wouldn't change that for anything. Even knowing how we began, even knowing you were given no choice. But I did have a choice, Marguerite said. I could have hardened my heart against you. I could have fulfilled my duties while keeping myself separate and protected. Instead, I chose to open myself to the possibility of more. I chose to see you, to know you, to love you. Those were choices, Maximilian, and I would make them again. He pulled her into his arms, uncaring of who might see. What did I do to deserve you? You saved me, she replied simply, and then you let me save you in return. The London season concluded, and they returned to Kingsley Park with relief. The country suited them both better than the city, the peace and privacy allowing them to simply be together without the constant performance required by society. One morning, in late summer, Marguerite woke feeling unwell. At first, she attributed it to something she had eaten, but when the nausea persisted for several days, Lucy suggested a possibility that Marguerite had not yet considered. Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but could you be with child? Marguerite froze, her hand going instinctively to her abdomen. It had been 3 months since their marriage had been consummated. Could it be possible? The physician was summoned and confirmed what Lucy had suspected. Marguerite was approximately 6 weeks pregnant. The news filled her with a complex mixture of joy and terror. A child, an heir for Maximilian, a family of their own. She told him that evening over dinner, watching his face carefully for his reaction. For a long moment he simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he rose from his chair and crossed to her side of the table, pulling her up into his arms. "A child," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Our child. Marguerite, you have given me everything, everything I thought I could never have. A wife I love, a real marriage, and now a child. I don't have words for what I feel." "Then don't use words," she replied, pulling his face down to hers. "Just hold me." They stood there in the dining room, wrapped in each other's arms while the footman pretended not to notice, and the food grew cold on the table. This moment, Marguerite thought, was worth everything that had come before. All the pain, all the fear, all the uncertainty. She had been sold to pay debts. She had married a stranger in a transaction devoid of affection. But from that cold beginning had grown something warm and vital and infinitely precious. Love, family, a future she could never have imagined. "Not a debt," Maximilian murmured against her hair, as though he could read her thoughts. "Never a debt. You are my destiny, Marguerite. You always were." Continuing story, in part 6 of 8. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through autumn and into winter. Marguerite's figure began to round, and Maximilian became hilariously overprotective, trying to prevent her from climbing stairs or riding horses or doing anything more strenuous than sitting quietly with her embroidery. "I am pregnant, not an invalid," she reminded him repeatedly. "Women have been managing this condition since the beginning of time." "Not my wife," he replied stubbornly. "My wife will be careful and safe, and our child will be born healthy." His protectiveness was simultaneously frustrating and touching. This man who had seemed so cold and untouchable when they first married now hovered over her anxiously, his hand constantly seeking her growing belly, his face lighting up whenever the baby moved. "You're going to be insufferable as a father," Marguerite teased one evening as they sat together in the library, her feet elevated on cushions as he insisted. "I'm aware," he replied cheerfully. "I will spoil our children atrociously and worry constantly about their safety. You will have to be the voice of reason." "Our children," she repeated, catching the plural. "How many are you planning?" "As many as you're willing to give me. I was lonely as an only child. I want our children to have siblings, to grow up surrounded by family." He paused, his hand stilling on her belly. "If that's agreeable to you, of course." "It's very agreeable," Marguerite assured him. "I want a house full of children. I want noise and chaos and joy. I want everything we didn't have growing up." "Then that's what we'll create, together." Winter brought her parents for an extended visit. Lord Bellamy had aged noticeably in the months since the wedding, the strain of his previous circumstances having taken their toll, despite the relief of having his debts cleared. But he seemed lighter now, happier, his pride in his daughter evident in every word and gesture. "You've done well for yourself," he told Marguerite one afternoon when they were alone. "Better than I dared hope when the situation was at its worst." "You did what you had to do," Marguerite replied, "and it brought me to Maximilian. I cannot regret that." "The Duke is a good man," her father said. "I doubted him at first, thought him cold and calculating, but I see now how he looks at you. He loves you genuinely. That's worth more than all the wealth and titles in England." "It is," Marguerite agreed softly. "It is indeed." Her mother was equally delighted with the pregnancy, already knitting tiny garments and making plans for the christening. "A grandchild," she exclaimed repeatedly, "and the heir to a dukedom. Your father and I are so proud of you, dearest." Maximilian treated her parents with careful respect, ensuring they were comfortable and welcome at Kingsley Park. He settled an even more generous annual income on them than he had initially promised, and he made certain they understood they would always have a home and a place in their grandchild's life. "You didn't have to be so generous," Marguerite told him after her parents had retired one evening. "They gave me you," he replied simply. "That deserves acknowledgement. They sold me to you. They put you in a position where our paths crossed. The rest was us, our choices, our efforts, our love. But I'm grateful to them nonetheless." Spring arrived with the promise of new life, and Marguerite's confinement drew near. The physician warned that first babies often came late, but Marguerite found herself impatiently waiting, wanting to meet this child they had created, wanting to hold their daughter or son in her arms. "Do you hope for a boy or a girl?" she asked Maximilian one evening as they sat together in the drawing room. "I hope for a healthy child and a safe delivery for you," he replied. "That's all that matters to me." "But surely you want an heir." "I want you alive and well. We can try again for an heir if this one is a girl. But I cannot try again for you, Marguerite. You are irreplaceable." The depth of his love never failed to move her. "I will be fine," she assured him. "Women survive childbirth every day." "And some do not," he said quietly. "I am aware of the risks. It terrifies me." She took his hand, placing it on her belly where the baby was moving restlessly. "Feel that? That's your child, strong and active and ready to be born. Have faith, Maximilian. Have faith in me, in us, in this new life we're bringing into the world." "I do have faith," he said, "but I also have fear. The two can exist together." 2 weeks later, in the early hours of a warm May morning, Marguerite's labor began. The pain was intense, far worse than she had anticipated, and as the hours stretched on, she began to understand Maximilian's fears. This was no simple matter. This was a battle between life and death, between her body's determination to bring forth new life and the very real possibility that the process might kill them both. Maximilian stayed with her throughout, ignoring the physician's suggestions that he wait elsewhere, as was customary. He held her hand through each contraction, wiped her brow, whispered encouragements when she was certain she could not continue. "I'm here," he kept saying. "I'm right here with you. You're the strongest person I know. You can do this." Finally, after 18 hours of labor, their child entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to both their eyes. A daughter, perfect and healthy, with a shock of dark hair and her father's pale gray eyes. "A girl," the physician announced, placing the baby in Marguerite's arms. "Congratulations, Your Graces." Marguerite looked down at her daughter, this tiny, perfect being that she and Maximilian had created, and felt a love so fierce it stole her breath. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." Maximilian, his face wet with tears he made no attempt to hide, reached out to stroke the baby's cheek with one finger. "She's beautiful, just like her mother, and strong like her father," Marguerite added. "What shall we name her?" They had discussed names for months, but never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their daughter, Maximilian said, "Victoria, for victory, because this, you, her, us, is the greatest victory I could ever imagine." "Victoria Marguerite Ashford," Marguerite said, testing the name. "Yes, it's perfect." The months following Victoria's birth were simultaneously exhausting and joyful. Marguerite, despite Maximilian's protests, insisted on nursing the baby herself rather than employing a wet nurse. "I want this time with her," she said. "I want every moment." Maximilian was besotted with his daughter. He would sit for hours simply watching her sleep, marveling at her tiny fingers and toes, laughing with delight at every small noise or movement she made. The staff at Kingsley Park grew accustomed to the sight of the fearsome Duke of Kingsley carrying his daughter through the halls, talking to her in gentle tones about estate management and the proper way to evaluate horseflesh. "You're creating a monster," Marguerite teased. "She'll grow up thinking she can rule the world." "She can rule the world if she wishes," Maximilian replied, bouncing Victoria gently. "She's a daughter of the Duke of Kingsley. She can do anything." When Victoria was 6 months old, they returned to London for a brief visit. The society that had once whispered about the unconventional beginning of their marriage now looked upon them with something approaching envy. The cold Duke of Kingsley, once thought incapable of genuine feeling, was obviously deeply in love with his wife and daughter. It was a transformation that fascinated the ton. At a dinner party, Lady Pemberton approached Marguerite during the after-dinner gathering in the drawing-room. "You've accomplished something quite remarkable, Your Grace," she said. "Have I?" Marguerite replied, keeping her tone neutral. "You've thawed the Ice Duke, made him human again. Some of us were beginning to think it impossible." Marguerite thought about correcting the woman's assumptions, about explaining that Maximilian had never been ice, only wounded and careful, but decided it wasn't worth the effort. Let them believe what they wished. She knew the truth of her husband, and that was what mattered. Love has a way of surprising us, Marguerite said instead. We are none of us quite who we seem on the surface. Later, as they prepared to depart for Kingsley Park, Maximilian helped her into the carriage where Victoria slept peacefully in her nurse's arms. "Are you sorry?" he asked suddenly, "about how we began? About being sold to me like property to settle debts?" Marguerite looked at him, this man who had purchased her in a business transaction and then given her everything money could not buy. Love, partnership, a family, a future bright with possibility. "I'm not sorry," she said firmly, "not even a little. You were right, Maximilian. I was never a debt. I was always your destiny. Just as you were always mine. We just didn't know it yet." He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Thank you for choosing me, for choosing us, for taking this strange beginning and making it into something beautiful." "Thank you for seeing me," she replied, "for looking at a woman sold to pay debts and recognizing someone worth loving." As the carriage rolled away from London, carrying them home to Kingsley Park, Marguerite reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them here. She had been sold like property, married to a stranger, thrust into a life she had never chosen. And yet, from that unpromising beginning, had grown the greatest love she could imagine. Sometimes, she thought, destiny wore strange disguises. Sometimes the worst thing that could happen was actually the first step toward the best thing. Sometimes being sold to pay debts was really being delivered to the man you were always meant to love. And sometimes whispered in the right ear. At the right moment, the words, "You're not a debt, you're my destiny," could change everything. Continuing story. Part 7 of 8. 3 years passed in a blur of happiness and domesticity. Victoria grew into a precocious toddler with her father's intensity and her mother's determination, a combination that kept both parents constantly on their toes. Marguerite gave birth to a son, Edmund, named after her father in a gesture that moved Lord Bellamy to tears, and then another daughter, Charlotte. Kingsley Park rang with the sounds of children's laughter, a transformation that delighted everyone who knew the Duke's previous solitary existence. He had become, against all expectations, a devoted family man. His business interests remained, his position in society unchallenged, but his priority was always his family. "You've gone soft, Kingsley," one of his business associates teased at a meeting in London. "I prefer to think of it as gaining proper priorities," Maximilian replied with a smile that would have shocked anyone who remembered the cold man he had once been. Marguerite had grown into her role as Duchess with grace and confidence. She managed the vast household with efficiency, hosted gatherings when necessary, and corresponded regularly with family and friends. But her greatest joy was in the quiet domestic moments, reading to Victoria by the fire, nursing baby Charlotte, watching Maximilian teach young Edmund to ride. One evening in autumn, after the children had been put to bed, Marguerite and Maximilian sat together in the library, as was their custom. She was working on embroidery for Charlotte's christening gown, and he was reviewing estate accounts, but the silence between them was comfortable and warm. "Do you ever think about that night at White's?" Marguerite asked suddenly. Maximilian set down his papers. "Sometimes. Why do you ask?" "I was thinking about how different our lives might have been if you hadn't intervened. If Ashford had succeeded in his scheme, or if some other resolution had been found, we might never have met. These children might never have existed. The thought terrifies me, Maximilian admitted, that we might have missed each other entirely, that you might have been married to someone else, living some other life. Do you still feel guilty? Marguerite asked. About how we began. He considered the question carefully. Not guilty, exactly, but aware. Aware that I held all the power in our initial arrangement, that you had little choice in becoming my wife. I hope I've used that power responsibly. I hope I've given you a life worth living. Marguerite set aside her embroidery and moved to sit beside him on the sofa. You've given me more than a life worth living. You've given me joy, love, purpose, our children, yourself. I look back at that frightened young woman being sold to pay debts, and I want to tell her not to be afraid. I want to tell her that the man who purchased her will become the love of her life, that she will be happier than she ever dreamed possible. You weren't just purchased, Maximilian said quietly. You were chosen. From the moment I saw you at that first meeting, something in me recognized something in you. I told myself it was merely practical. You would make a suitable Duchess. You understood the transactional nature of our arrangement. But I think even then, some part of me knew. Knew what? That you were going to change everything. That you were going to crack open my carefully constructed walls and teach me how to feel again. That you were going to be the most important person in my life. Marguerite leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. Do you remember what you said to me that night? After Ashford tried to claim me? I said many things that night. You told my father that I was not a debt, but your destiny. I thought it was just pretty words meant to ease the transaction. But you were right, weren't you? We were always meant to find each other. The method was just unconventional. Unconventional, Maximilian repeated with a laugh. That's a diplomatic way to describe being sold to pay gambling debts. Perhaps, but it brought us together, and I wouldn't change that for anything. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling softly, the house quiet around them. Finally, Maximilian spoke again. I want to tell you something. Something I've never told anyone. What is it? That night at White's, when I heard Ashford making his vile proposal to your father, I could have simply paid the debts without demanding marriage in return. I had more than enough wealth. I could have helped your family anonymously and walked away. Marguerite pulled back to look at him. Why didn't you? Because I had seen you, earlier that season, at various social functions. You were different from the other young ladies. You didn't simper or flatter. You stood quietly at the edges of rooms, watching, thinking. You seemed real, genuine, and I found myself thinking about you more often than was sensible. When the opportunity arose to make you mine, I took it. I told myself it was practical, that I needed a wife and you fit the requirements. But the truth is, I wanted you specifically. I wanted you from the moment I first saw you. Marguerite stared at him, processing this revelation. You planned this? Our marriage? Not planned, exactly. But when the opportunity arose, I seized it. Does that change how you feel? Are you angry? She considered her feelings carefully. Was she angry? No. If anything, she was moved by his admission. You wanted me, she said slowly. Not just any suitable woman, me specifically. Yes. And you used your wealth and power to make me yours. Yes. That should probably horrify me, Marguerite mused. The ruthlessness of it, the calculation. But does it? No, she said finally, because you didn't use that power to hurt me. You used it to save my family and to claim something you wanted. And then, once you had me, you spent every day earning my love rather than simply demanding it as your right. You could have been cruel. You could have treated me as property. Instead, you treated me with kindness and patience and respect. You gave me time to come to you willingly. That matters more than the method of our beginning. Maximilian pulled her close. I love you, Marguerite, more than I have words to express. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. Our children are precious. This life we've built is precious. But you are everything. I love you too, she replied. My cold Duke, who isn't cold at all. My destiny disguised as a debt. Final section, Part 8 of 8. 5 more years passed, bringing 2 additional children, twins, Alexander and Amelia, and cementing the Ashford family's reputation as one of the happiest in England. The Duke of Kingsley, once feared for his cold ruthlessness, was now equally known for his devotion to his Duchess and their growing brood. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Maximilian arranged a surprise for Marguerite. He had commissioned a portrait of their family, all 7 of them arranged in the library at Kingsley Park, surrounded by the books they both loved, with the windows overlooking the gardens where they had fallen in love. It's beautiful, Marguerite breathed when he unveiled it. We look so happy. We are happy, Maximilian replied. That's not artistic interpretation. That's truth. The portrait was hung in the long gallery, joining generations of Ashfords who had come before. But there was something different about this portrait. A warmth, a life, a joy that was absent from the stern faces surrounding it. Let them see, Maximilian said as they stood before it. Let future generations know that the Duke who was called cold and ruthless was actually capable of deep love. Let them see what we built from an unpromising beginning. That evening, after the children had been put to bed, they returned to the library where so much of their relationship had developed. Marguerite poured them each a glass of wine, and they toasted to 10 years of marriage. Do you remember our wedding night? Maximilian asked. How you slept alone, probably terrified I would come to claim my marital rights. I do, Marguerite said. I waited in that enormous bed, so nervous, so uncertain, and you never came. I wanted to, he admitted, but I needed you to want me too. I needed it to be your choice. It was the right decision, Marguerite said, though I didn't understand it at the time. But it showed me that you weren't the monster I feared you might be. It gave me hope that our marriage might become something more than a transaction. It became everything, Maximilian said. You became everything. We became everything, Marguerite corrected. Together. That's what matters. Not how we began, but what we became. They sat together in companionable silence, reflecting on the decade that had passed. So much had changed since that night at White's, when a desperate father had accepted an offer to sell his daughter to settle debts. So much had grown from that cold beginning. Tell me something, Marguerite said. If you could go back to that night, knowing everything that would follow, would you change anything? Maximilian considered carefully. I would change the suffering it caused you, the fear, the feeling of being property rather than a person. I would change those things if I could. But the result? This life we've built? Our love? Our children? No, I wouldn't change that. though I wish the path to it could have been gentler for you." "The path made me strong," Marguerite replied. "It taught me that I could survive things I thought would break me. It taught me that I was more than my circumstances, more than what was done to me. And it brought me to you, so no, I wouldn't change it either. Not even the beginning? Not even being sold to pay debts? Not even that. Because you looked at me in that first meeting in my father's drawing room, and you saw me. Not a commodity, not a solution to a problem, but a person worth knowing, a woman worth choosing. And then you spent the rest of our lives proving that you meant it. That's what matters. Not that I was sold, but that I was seen." Maximilian reached for her hand, lifting it to his lips. "I see you, Marguerite. I have always seen you, and I will continue seeing you, loving you, choosing you every day for the rest of my life." "And I you," she replied, "my husband, my love, my destiny." They sat there as the fire burned low, 10 years into a marriage that had begun as a transaction and become a testament to love's ability to transform even the most unpromising circumstances. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, marking the passage of time. Inside, in the warmth of Kingsley Park, two people who had been brought together by debts and desperation held each other close, grateful for every moment of the extraordinary life they had built. The Duke of Kingsley had purchased a wife to settle a debt, but he had found a partner, a love, a completion he had never imagined possible. And the young woman who had been sold to save her family had discovered that sometimes the worst thing that happens to us is actually a gift in disguise, a harsh beginning to a beautiful story. Years later, when their grandchildren would ask about how their grandparents met, Marguerite would smile and say, "Your grandfather saved my family from ruin and gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams." And Maximilian would add, "Your grandmother saved me from a life of cold isolation and gave me everything worth having." Both statements were true. Both captured the complex reality of a relationship that had begun in the shadowy confines of a gaming hell and had grown into something radiant with love and joy. On their 50th wedding anniversary, elderly but still deeply in love, they would return to that library one last time. Maximilian would take Marguerite's hand, her fingers gnarled now with age, but still precious to him, and he would repeat the words he had spoken so many decades before. "You are not a debt, Marguerite. You never were. You are my destiny. You always were." And she would smile, tears in her eyes, and reply, "And you are mine. From that first moment to this last breath, you are mine." That is how love transforms us. That is how the most unpromising beginnings can lead to the most extraordinary endings. That is the story of the Duke who purchased a wife to settle debts and discovered instead the greatest treasure of his life, a woman who saw past his coldness to the man beneath, a partner who would walk beside him through joy and sorrow, a love that would endure long after the circumstances of their meeting had faded into history. In the end, it didn't matter how they began. What mattered was what they became. Together, the end.